As I stood at the edge of their table, the world around me faded into silence. Her laughter stopped mid-sentence as her eyes met mine, wide with shock, her face pale. Calmly, I slid the divorce letter between her wine glass and plate. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady but cold. Her lover froze, his confidence crumbling as he realized who I was. The weight of betrayal hung thick in the air as her trembling hands opened the envelope, her expression shifting from confusion to pure despair. This was the moment everything unraveled. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. The restaurant exuded an air of understated elegance, its dim lighting casting golden hues over polished wine glasses and pristine white tablecloths. Soft music drifted through the air, mingling with the gentle murmur of discreet conversations. Laughter, light and carefree, punctuated the atmosphere, but for John, it was a cruel symphony underscoring his heartbreak. He stood at the entrance, his suit immaculate, his expression composed, stone-like. In his hand, a crisp, white envelope trembled slightly, the divorce papers within a silent testament to the storm that raged beneath his calm exterior. His eyes, however, betrayed him. Dark with unshed pain, they flickered toward the far corner where she sat, her back to him, her laughter filling the space like a dagger to his chest. Sarah's hand rested lightly on Peter's arm, her touch lingering in a way that spoke of intimacy. She leaned toward him, her blue dress shimmering under the low light. An echo of their past, a cruel irony that twisted the knife further. Peter, confident and oblivious, smiled, his hand brushing hers as if the world existed only for them. The air was thick, suffocating. Every breath John took felt labored, the weight of betrayal pressing heavily on his chest. He took a step forward, the ground beneath him unsteady, the moment charged with a tension that threatened to shatter everything. Their marriage had begun like a vivid painting, each stroke vibrant with shared dreams and unshakable passion. Evenings brimmed with laughter, hands clasped tightly under warm candlelight. Yet over time the colors dulled. Routine crept in like an unwelcome guest, transforming heartfelt conversations into mechanical exchanges. Dinners together became quieter, the clinking of cutlery filling the void where words once flourished. Their bed, once a sanctuary of whispered secrets and gentle caresses, grew colder, the space between them a chasm neither dared to cross. John's attempts to reignite their connection, a surprise bouquet, a planned getaway, were met with Sarah's polite but distant smiles, her gaze often elsewhere. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself yearning for something intangible, a spark that routine had extinguished. She avoided John's questioning eyes, her affection reduced to fleeting gestures that felt like echoes of a distant past. The small moments, the way she turned away when he leaned in, the hesitation before a reluctant embrace, spoke volumes. And so their idyllic union unraveled slowly, thread by thread, leaving behind a fragile framework of what once was. It was in this fragile silence that John began to sense the unspoken truth lurking beneath their facade. The cracks had been small at first, almost imperceptible. Sarah's occasional late nights were easily explained. An art event here, a meeting with students there. At least, that's what she told him. John, ever the trusting husband, brushed away the faint unease that tickled the edges of his thoughts. But the unease grew, evolving into a persistent knot in his chest. One evening, she arrived home hours later than expected, her face flushed and her explanation rehearsed but hollow. The gallery owner wanted to discuss a future collaboration, she said, avoiding his eyes as she slid past him into the kitchen. John nodded, but her words lingered, their cadence unnatural, her tone strained. Then came the phone calls. On more than one occasion, John had entered the room to find Sarah speaking in hushed tones, her laughter forced and unfamiliar. The moment she noticed him, the call would abruptly end. "Just a student," she'd explain with a wave of her hand, her smile strained. But her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore, and John couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping further away with every call. It was the little things that began to haunt him, the perfume lingering on her coat, one he didn't recognize, the way her phone seemed glued to her hand, notifications buzzing incessantly. Once, as they sat side by side on the couch, she flinched when he leaned closer, tucking her phone out of sight. "It's nothing," she assured him, but the tension in her voice betrayed her. The late nights became more frequent. When he asked where she'd been, her answers grew vaguer, her excuses thinner. "Just a last-minute meeting," she'd say. "You know how demanding the school can be." Her eyes darted to anything but his as she spoke, her hands fidgeting with her bag. One rainy evening, as she rushed out the door claiming to meet a colleague, John stood in the quiet hallway watching her disappear into the downpour. For the first time, anger sparked within him, mingling with his hurt. He wanted to believe her, but every instinct told him otherwise. That night, as he sat in his darkened study, John made a decision. He couldn't ignore the signs any longer. If Sarah was hiding something, he would uncover it. Painful as it might be, he needed the truth, no matter the cost. The decision to hire a private investigator wasn't one John made lightly. For weeks, he had wrestled with the idea, torn between wanting to trust Sarah and needing to confront the gnawing doubt consuming him. But after another night of vague excuses and hurried departures, he realized that trust was no longer enough. He needed answers. He opened his office door and said, "Now?" The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Alina, was efficient and discreet. She listened carefully as John recounted Sarah's late-night meetings, the suspicious phone calls, and the increasingly cold atmosphere at home. "It could be nothing," John said, almost pleading with himself. Alina nodded, her expression unreadable. "But if it's something," she replied calmly, "we'll find it." The first few days yielded little more than the same routine John already knew. Sarah leaving the house, supposedly for work errands. But on the third day, Elena called with a lead. "She's meeting someone," she said. "Not at a gallery or school, but a cafe downtown." John's heart sank as Elena sent photos of Sarah with another man. The images showed her leaning toward him, her face illuminated by a smile that John hadn't seen in years. Her hand rested lightly on his, their posture intimate, comfortable. The man was tall, well-dressed, and exuded confidence. But his face was unfamiliar, a stranger who had somehow become a part of Sarah's life. Elena didn't stop there. Over the next week, she trailed the man, Peter, as Sarah had called him in intercepted texts. His background was murky, his movements suspicious. "He's not just someone she's seeing," Elena said during their next meeting. "He's a professional con artist. He's done this before, finding vulnerable women, charming them, and exploiting their trust for financial gain." John felt his chest tighten as Elena presented the evidence, a history of aliases, fraudulent bank accounts, and connections to prior scams. Peter had a pattern, and Sarah fit his profile perfectly. Someone yearning for change, with enough wealth to become a target. The bank records sealed it. Transfers Sarah had made to accounts John didn't recognize, sums that were significant but carefully spread out to avoid suspicion. The betrayal hit John like a physical blow. It wasn't just that Sarah had been unfaithful. She had entrusted their family's security to a man who saw her as nothing more than a payday. The realization was devastating. Every smile, every excuse, every lie Sarah had told wasn't just about her affair. It was about the life they had built together, unraveling under the weight of her choices. Yet, as much as anger coursed through him, there was something deeper, a profound sadness for the woman he had loved. Sarah, who once glowed with joy and passion, had become someone else entirely, someone desperate enough to believe Peter's hollow promises. John knew what he had to do. He would confront them both, not in a moment of blind rage, but with calculated precision. This wasn't just about exposing their betrayal. It was about reclaiming his dignity and putting an end to the charade that had taken over his life. As he stared at the evidence laid out before him, John's resolve hardened. The truth, however painful, was his weapon now. The restaurant was an orchestra of refinement, the clink of glasses, the soft murmur of conversation, and the muted notes of a piano weaving through the air. John stepped inside, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor, his expression composed but unreadable. To the casual observer, he was just another guest, a man in a suit, perhaps here for a business dinner or a romantic evening. But the envelope in his hand told a different story. He scanned the room briefly, his gaze calculated until it landed on them. Sarah, radiant in the blue dress he had given her, was leaning slightly toward Peter, her laughter light and effortless. Peter, confident as ever, rested his hand on the table, his fingers brushing hers. The intimacy between them was undeniable, their world seemingly contained in that small, candle-lit space. John's chest tightened, but his face remained impassive. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsed every step in his mind. Now, it was time to act. As he moved toward their table, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. The maitre d' greeted him politely, but John barely nodded in acknowledgement. His eyes were fixed ahead, his steps measured and deliberate, each one echoing like a drumbeat in his ears. Sarah didn't see him at first. She was mid-sentence, her hand gesturing animatedly as Peter smiled, clearly absorbed in the performance. But as John approached, her laughter faltered. It was subtle, a flicker of hesitation in her voice, a sudden awareness of being watched. Her eyes darted up, meeting John's, and in an instant, her expression froze. Her face drained of color, the playful smile replaced by a mix of shock and fear. Peter, sensing the shift, glanced over his shoulder, his confident demeanor faltering as he locked eyes with John. The man who had seemed so self-assured now looked uneasy, his fingers twitching slightly as he shifted in his seat. "Good evening," John said, his voice calm and steady, though the weight behind it was unmistakable. He placed the envelope on the table, sliding it between Sarah's wineglass and her plate with a deliberate motion. The sound of paper meeting wood seemed to echo louder than the surrounding conversation. Neither of them spoke at first. Sarah stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered above the table. Peter leaned back, attempting to regain his composure, but his discomfort was evident in the way his jaw tightened, his eyes darting between John and Sarah. John's gaze never wavered. He stood tall, his hands at his sides, a picture of restrained power. "I think you should read it," he said, his tone devoid of malice, yet carrying an undeniable authority. Sarah's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope, hesitant, as though touching it would make the truth it held unbearable. Peter, meanwhile, cleared his throat, attempting to interrupt the moment. "Look, maybe this isn't the place." John's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unyielding. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Peter shrank back slightly, the bravado slipping from his face. Sarah finally opened the envelope, her hand shaking so much that the paper rustled as she unfolded it. Her eyes skimmed the words, and with each line, her face crumpled further. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, glancing up at John with a mixture of despair and desperation. "John, He raised a hand, silencing her. "Don't," he said softly but firmly. "I know everything, Sarah. Every excuse, every lie. I've watched it all unfold, and now it ends here." The room seemed to hold its breath, the surrounding diners blissfully unaware of the storm unfolding just a few feet away. Peter shifted uncomfortably, his confidence evaporating as John's focus turned to him. "And you," John said, his voice colder now, "do you want to explain yourself, or should I do it for you?" Peter stammered, his composure cracking. I think we should all calm down." John leaned in slightly, his calm exterior masking the fury simmering beneath. "Calm," he echoed, his voice dangerously quiet. "You've conned my wife, stolen from my family, and destroyed the life we built. You don't get to ask for calm." Sarah's tears finally spilled over, her composure breaking completely as she buried her face in her hands. Peter, looking increasingly cornered, glanced toward the door as though contemplating an escape. But John didn't move, his presence unyielding, the moment hanging heavy with unspoken words. Finally, John straightened, the weight of the confrontation settling over him. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," he said, his voice low but resolute. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt deafening in its finality. The tension in the air was palpable as John spoke, his voice low but laced with an edge sharp enough to cut through the atmosphere. "Good evening," he said, his gaze fixed on Sarah. He placed the envelope deliberately on the table. "I think you should read this." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands hovered uncertainly over the envelope, trembling as if the paper itself burned. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes darted between John and Peter, searching for answers she didn't want to hear. John's expression didn't change. His calm exterior was a stark contrast to the storm raging beneath the surface. "I'm finishing what you started," he replied evenly, his words measured but weighted with finality. "Go on. Open it." Haddock hurried forward to open the barrier, but the scream caught him and quickly retreated. Sarah's fingers fumbled as she picked up the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words, and the color drained from her face. "Now," she whispered, shaking her head. This isn't necessary. We can talk about this." John's eyes narrowed, his voice unyielding. "Talk? Like the way you've been talking to him?" He gestured toward Peter without breaking his gaze from Sarah. Peter, who had been sitting in uneasy silence, straightened in his chair. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Listen," he began, his tone overly casual. "I don't think this is the time or place for—" John cut him off, his voice sharp but quiet enough not to draw attention from the surrounding tables. "Don't," he said, his eyes locking onto Peter's with an intensity that made him falter. "You've had plenty of time to run your little game. It's over now." Peter shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "This is a misunderstanding." John leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "Is it? Should I explain to Sarah about your history? The scams, the aliases, the money transfers? Or would you like to do that yourself?" Sarah's head snapped toward Peter, her expression a mix of confusion and betrayal. "What is he talking about?" she demanded, her voice cracking. Peter stammered, his composure crumbling. "Sarah, I can explain—" "Enough," John said, standing upright, his gaze heavy with finality. "You've both said enough. Now, live with it." He turned and walked away, leaving behind silence as devastating as his words. John stood still, his presence commanding, as he shifted his focus entirely to Peter. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of a hammer striking cold steel. "Your future with him," John said, his eyes flicking towards Sarah. "It's built on lies. Every dollar, every promise. It was all a con." Sarah froze, her lips trembling as though forming words had suddenly become impossible. Her hand clutched the edge of the napkin on her lap, fingers tightening around the fabric in a desperate attempt to ground herself. Her breathing quickened, and her gaze darted back and forth between the two men, searching for a lifeline, a shred of clarity in the chaos John's words had unleashed. Peter tried to recover, a nervous laugh escaping him. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice cracked at the edges, betraying his unease. "John, you're upset, I get that, but let's not throw around baseless accusations." John raised a brow, his expression unreadable but his tone cutting. "Baseless." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small folder, tossing it onto the table. The papers inside fanned out slightly, revealing snapshots of bank transfers, aliases, and prior victims. "Is this baseless? The money she wired to you? The promises you made her? Or maybe the other women you left behind when their accounts ran dry?" Then, Sarah's hands shook visibly as she reached for the folder. Her tear-filled eyes scanned the documents, her lips mouthing silent words she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. Her chest heaved as the truth began to sink in. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. This isn't true. Peter, tell him he's lying." Peter shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his confidence draining like water through a sieve. He opened his mouth but found no words, no clever retort to save himself. His usual charm was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic as he glanced toward the exit. John, his gaze never wavering, took a step closer. "Go ahead, Peter," he said softly, his tone lethal in its calmness. "Tell her it's a lie. Tell her you didn't use her. Convince her that the thousands she gave you weren't part of your plan." "Sarah," Peter started, his voice pleading. but Sarah cut him off, her trembling hands slamming the folders shut. Tears spilled down her cheeks, her shoulders shaking as her body betrayed the weight of her devastation. "How could you?" she gasped, her words choked and uneven. Her hand went to her face, covering her mouth as if to hold back a scream. Her napkin, now crumpled beyond recognition, slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor. She turned her tear-streaked face to Peter, her eyes wide with disbelief. Was any of it real? Peter hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find an answer. But his silence was louder than any confession. It was the only answer Sarah needed. John watched her crumble, his face set but his eyes softening for a fleeting moment. There was no satisfaction in seeing her broken like this, no sense of triumph, just the hollow ache of a truth finally laid bare. "You betrayed me," John said, his voice quieter now but still firm. "But worse, you betrayed yourself. You let him manipulate you, let him turn our life into a tool for his schemes, and now he'll leave you with nothing." Sarah's sobs filled the space, raw and unguarded. Her hands trembled as they reached for John, a silent plea for something. Understanding, forgiveness, anything. But he stepped back, the distance between them both literal and symbolic. "I didn't mean," she started, but her voice broke, the words slipping away like sand through her fingers. John's expression hardened again, his resolve firm. "Meaning to doesn't undo what you've done. This is the end, Sarah. For us, for everything we built." He turned to Peter, his gaze icy. "And you'll face the consequences soon enough." With that, John turned on his heel, leaving Sarah and Peter in stunned silence. The sound of his footsteps receded, each one echoing with finality. At the table, Sarah collapsed into herself, tears streaming down her face as the weight of her choices came crashing down. Peter's facade of confidence shattered completely. His eyes darted around the restaurant, scanning for an escape route, as if the walls themselves were closing in. His once relaxed posture was now stiff and uneasy, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. The weight of John's revelations and Sarah's tearful disbelief had stripped away his charm, leaving only a desperate, cornered man. Ian said, I think this has gone far enough," Peter muttered, his voice barely audible and trembling. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the screech of its legs against the floor turning heads from nearby tables. "This isn't my fight. I don't need to be part of this." John watched him with cold, detached amusement, crossing his arms as Peter stumbled to stand. "Running already?" he asked, his voice low but cutting through the tension like a knife. "Isn't this the part where you spin one of your famous stories, Peter? Convince her it's all a misunderstanding? Read me my rights to the word cervical pain and count the 4 paragraphs I signed?" Peter smiled. Peter didn't respond, his face flushed as he adjusted his jacket with shaky hands. His gaze flicked briefly to Sarah, who sat paralyzed by her own grief, her tear-streaked face a silent testament to the destruction he had wrought. Seeing no solace there, he turned toward the exit, his movements hurried and clumsy, a stark contrast to the suave demeanor he had displayed earlier. "Go ahead," John called after him, his tone laced with disdain. "Run, like you always do. That's the man you chose over us, Sarah," he added, turning to his wife. His words hit like a hammer, each syllable deliberate and unrelenting. "A coward who takes what he can and bolts the moment things get difficult. He'll leave you with nothing, just like I said." Peter hesitated for a fraction of a second at the door, as though considering a retort, but no words came. The weight of John's gaze pressed on him like a heavy stone, and he finally pushed the door open, disappearing into the night, without so much as a backward glance. The restaurant seemed to exhale as he left, the tension easing slightly, though the aftermath still lingered thick in the air. John let out a quiet sigh, his eyes settling on Sarah one last time. "You see, Sarah," he said, his voice softer but no less firm, "when you gamble everything on a lie, this is all you're left with." And with that, he walked away, leaving Sarah alone to face the emptiness Peter had left behind. As the weight of Peter's departure settled over the table, Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "John, please." Her hands still shaking reached out toward him, a fragile gesture that spoke of desperation. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. "But you—" She choked on her words, tears streaming down her face. "You can't just leave like this. We can fix it. I can fix it." John's gaze shifted to her, his expression unyielding, his jaw tight. For a brief moment he didn't say anything, letting her words linger in the heavy air between them. Sarah pressed on, her voice breaking as she continued. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant to hurt you, never meant for any of this to happen. Please, John, don't let it end this way." Her eyes, red and swollen, searched his face for any sign of softness, any glimmer of hope that he might relent, but his cold, steely gaze didn't waver. "End this way?" he repeated, his voice measured and low. "Sarah, it ended the moment you made your choice." "No," she sobbed, shaking her head. "It was a mistake. I was lost. I didn't—" Her voice cracked, and she covered her mouth with trembling hands. "I didn't know what I was doing. I let myself believe something that wasn't real, but I see it now. I see everything now." John's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest flicker of something unspoken crossing his face before he straightened his posture. "You see it now?" he asked, his tone sharper, cutting through her pleas like ice. "After the lies, the deceit, and the betrayal? You see it now because you've lost everything. But you didn't see it when I was standing right in front of you, trying to hold us together." "I was wrong," she cried, her voice rising, raw and broken. "I was blind, selfish, whatever you want to call it. But I'm begging you, John, for the sake of our family, for the sake of what we used to have, please." John's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides before he exhaled slowly, his voice chillingly calm. "You made your choices, Sarah. Now live with them." The finality of his words left no room for argument, no space for hope. He turned and walked away, his steps steady, leaving Sarah crumpled in her seat, consumed by the weight of her loss. John stopped just as he reached the edge of the table, his back to Sarah. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, the weight of everything unsaid pressing on his shoulders. When he finally turned, his expression was no longer cold but resolute, a man making one final attempt to salvage what mattered most. "This isn't just about you and me anymore," he said, his voice quieter now, yet firm. "What's broken between us can't be fixed, Sarah. Not after this. But the kids, they still need a mother." Sarah's tear-streaked face lifted, her trembling hands clutching the table's edge as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "They don't deserve to suffer because of our mistakes," John continued, his gaze steady, his tone unwavering. "Whatever you've lost, whatever you've destroyed, it's not too late to be there for them. Fix yourself, Sarah, for their sake. If not for me." He lingered for a moment, as if searching her face for any sign that she understood. Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving her with the echo of his final plea, a responsibility she could no longer ignore. As John walked out of the restaurant into the crisp night air, a strange mix of emotions settled over him. Relief, like a deep exhale after holding his breath for too long, mingled with a dull, persistent ache in his chest. The decision to walk away felt final, but it wasn't without its weight. For years, he had loved Sarah with everything he had. He remembered the early days of their marriage, when they would stay up late talking about dreams that seemed so vivid, so possible. He could still picture her laughing at his clumsy attempts to dance in their tiny living room, or the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her art. Those memories, once a source of warmth, now felt distant, like watching someone else's life through a frosted window. He had tried to hold on to those moments, hoping they could be a foundation to rebuild on. But tonight had shown him the truth. That foundation had long since crumbled. His love for Sarah wasn't enough to bridge the chasm she had created with her betrayal. And yet, there was no anger left in him, only sorrow. Sorrow for what they had lost, for the future they had once envisioned but would never share. Most of all, sorrow for their children, who would now grow up in a world where the family they had known would be forever changed. As he reached his car, John paused, staring at the reflection of himself in the window. He looked tired, more than he ever remembered feeling. But behind the exhaustion, there was a faint spark of resolve. His children deserved better. They deserved stability, love, and a father who wouldn't let the bitterness of the past define their future. John exhaled slowly, straightening his posture. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to move forward. He would be there for his children, even if it meant carrying the emotional scars of betrayal alone. The love he had once poured into Sarah would now be redirected to them, ensuring they felt secure and cherished, even in the absence of the life he had fought so hard to preserve. And as he drove away, the sorrow began to loosen its grip, replaced by a quiet determination to start anew, for himself and, most importantly, for them. The house was silent, almost unbearably so. Sarah sat in the living room, her fingers tracing the edge of a framed family photo on the coffee table. The image showed a moment of joy, frozen in time. John smiling with his arm around her, their children laughing as they leaned into her side. It felt like a relic from another life, one that now seemed irretrievably distant. She stared at the photo for what felt like hours, her thoughts spiraling through the choices that had brought her here, the excuses she had given herself, her yearning for something new. The allure of Peter's charm now felt hollow and selfish. She had been searching for freedom, excitement, and a spark she thought had been extinguished. But in chasing those fleeting desires, she had lost everything that truly mattered. The echo of John's words in the restaurant haunted her. "Fix yourself for them, if not for me." His tone had been cold, final, but the truth behind it was undeniable. She had failed him, failed their marriage, and most painfully failed their children. Her chest tightened as she thought of their little faces, unaware of the storm brewing in their family. The emptiness of the house pressed in on her, amplifying her guilt. She moved to the couch and sank into its worn cushions, clutching a pillow to her chest as if it could shield her from the weight of her emotions. Memories flooded her, the nights she and John had spent planning their future, the laughter they had shared over small silly things. She had traded all of that for an illusion, and now she was left with the aftermath. But beneath the crushing guilt, a faint ember of resolve began to flicker. Sarah knew she couldn't undo the past, but she also knew she couldn't remain paralyzed by it. If she was going to rebuild anything, for herself, for her children, she needed to confront the person she had become and understand why she had allowed herself to fall so far. The next morning, she made the first step. She called a therapist, her voice shaky as she explained her situation. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. I don't recognize myself anymore." Therapy became a space for reflection, a painful but necessary mirror to her actions. Through the sessions, Sarah began to unpack the deeper truths she had avoided for so long: her dissatisfaction with herself, her fear of aging, her misguided belief that excitement came from someone else instead of within. She cried often in those sessions, but each tear felt like a release, a step toward understanding and rebuilding. At home, she started small. She cleaned out the rooms she had avoided for weeks, the ones still filled with John's absence. She wrote letters she knew she might never send, apologizing to him, to her children, even to herself. And she promised, silently but with conviction, that she would do better. Sarah knew the path ahead would be long and lonely, but for the first time in a while, she felt a faint sense of hope. The scars of her choices would remain, but she was determined to transform them into lessons, a foundation upon which to rebuild her life. In this time, she vowed, it would be with honesty, humility, and the unwavering love her children deserved. Peter's life of deceit unraveled quickly after the restaurant confrontation. With John's evidence in hand, Sarah, spurred by a mix of anger and regret, shared the information with authorities. It wasn't long before Peter's carefully constructed web of lies began to collapse. His fraudulent activities, scams, targeting vulnerable individuals under various aliases, caught up with him. A routine traffic stop led to his arrest when police discovered outstanding warrants tied to his previous cons. The carefully cultivated charm that once disarmed his victims was useless in the face of mounting evidence. In court, Peter attempted his usual defense, weaving tales of misunderstanding and victimhood. But the evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, bank transfers, and testimonies from multiple victims. The judge's verdict was swift and unforgiving, sentencing him to years behind bars. As the prison doors closed behind him, Peter finally faced the consequences of his greed, his silver tongue silenced by justice. Quote, John's life became a carefully constructed routine, each day meticulously planned to leave little room for reflection. His mornings were dedicated to preparing breakfast for his children, two small faces lighting up the kitchen table with sleepy smiles, unaware of the weight their father carried. As they chattered about their school projects and favorite cartoons, John smiled, nodding in encouragement, his heart both warmed and heavy. At work, he threw himself into his cases with relentless focus. His colleagues noticed his increased intensity, often mistaking it for ambition. But for John, it was a shield, a way to drown out the memories of what had been lost. He left little time for personal thoughts, each victory in court serving as a fleeting balm for the pain he kept buried deep inside. Evenings were for his children. He sat with them during homework time, read bedtime stories, and played board games, his laughter genuine, even if his mind occasionally wandered. He saw glimpses of Sarah in them, the way their daughter scrunched her nose when concentrating, or how his son's laugh mirrored hers. It was bittersweet, but he refused to let his pain cloud his love for them. From the perspective of his children, things were different, though they couldn't fully understand why. Their father seemed quieter, more serious. He no longer hummed tunes in the car or talked about the weekend plans with the same enthusiasm. They noticed that family dinners were just the three of them now, and that their mother's absence was rarely mentioned. "Why doesn't Mommy eat with us anymore?" his youngest asked one evening, her innocent voice cutting through the quiet. John hesitated, his fork pausing mid-air. "Mommy's busy right now," he said gently, his tone steady. "But we'll see her soon." The children accepted his words, returning to their plates, but John could see the confusion lingering in their eyes. He knew they sensed the shift, even if they couldn't articulate it, and that thought weighed on him more than anything else. At night, when the house was still and the children were asleep, John allowed himself brief moments of vulnerability. Sitting alone in the living room, he thought of the life he had lost and the walls he now built to protect himself from future pain. But those moments passed quickly. He had promises to keep, lives to nurture, and no time for what could have been.